Okay, I'm still happy to be in Dubai after a 16-hour trip from San Francisco. And so I'm a little jet lagged, but hopefully as I talk and as we have a wonderful interaction later with two young men who spent time in a real terrible prison, I'm going to talk before about the prison I created. Essentially, I want to talk about good and evil, about the Lucifer Effect, and my newest mission in life is creating a world filled with heroes. It actually is the concrete illustration of what Penny was just talking about. So essentially, what we're going to do is I'm going to start off talking about what makes ordinary people do evil deeds, and then at the end we're going to switch to say what makes ordinary people like you ideally become heroes. So we start with bad, we're going to end with good, and ideally in the end, good will triumph over evil. So the question is, what makes people go wrong? It's a question that we've asked for centuries. I want to ask the question, what makes good people turn evil? The reason we care is, it's not just an academic question. We think if we know the mechanisms by which this happens, we can begin to prevent it. We can begin to minimize it. So the famous story by Robert Louis Stevenson of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was really a story about the line. In that story, if you remember, Dr. Jekyll, who's a good man, invented a chemical that when he took it himself, he was transformed into the evil Mr. Hyde. When the drug wore off, he went back across the line between good and evil and became the good Dr. Jekyll. As a child, when I read that story, I was really interested in the line because the line was supposed to keep us good people safe. The line was supposed to be permanent and fixed. Bad people were there, good people like us were here. But the story forced me to entertain the possibility that the line is permeable, that it's shifting, that good people could be seduced across that line, and the positive news is that bad people could be rehabilitated. And that's what I want to talk about today. So good and evil have always been entwined. In this illusion, you see evil within inside of good. But if we go to the illusionist M.C. Escher, the Dutch artist, and we look at a world filled with demons and angels, if you focus on the white as the figure, you see a world filled with angels and little tutus. But if we look more closely now, and we focus on the black as the figure and the white as the background, we see a world full of demons. And so that tells us that the world has been, is, and will always be filled with both good and evil. And our job is to minimize the evil while maximizing the good in our city, in our country, and ideally in our world. So the Lucifer Effect is the Christian story, and apparently it's also a story in Islam about God's favorite angel was Lucifer. Lucifer means the bearer of light. In some scriptures he's called the morning star. Apparently in Islamic tradition he's not an angel but a jinn, a demon, a good demon who goes wrong. And what happens is that he defies God. When God creates Adam, his perfect creature, Lucifer and some other angels say, God, no, we don't want to honor him because we're angels, he's a mere mortal, and we existed prior to him. Well, that was not a God who was into conflict resolution. And he said, you just committed two sins, sin of pride and a sin of disobedience to authority. And he brings his hitman, Michael, the archangel, in. And of course, with God's help, the good angels beat up the fallen angels. And the interesting paradox is that Lucifer, God's favorite angel, is transformed into the devil, into Satan. And God is the person who created hell as the place to put the fallen angels. And symbolically, and then for many Christians, literally thinking of it as a physical place where evil people go to dwell forever. So in thinking about that story, which always influenced me as a kid, it just never made sense, it sets the context for my investigations for much of my life about how ordinary people, not angels, but ordinary people like any of us, could first step across the line between good and evil and begin to become perpetrators of evil. So, heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, and cast out devils. So it turns out 1/4 of all Americans really believe that evil is caused by the devil. They think that the devil really exists. As I think even more Americans believe that angels exist and angels guide their lives. So these are Lucifer Effect T-shirts, and I have some I brought from America. If you're interested, you can get some afterwards. And so The Lucifer Effect is a book I wrote recently which summarizes my view about what makes ordinary people turn evil. It focuses a lot in great depth on the Stanford Prison Study, which I'll describe briefly, but it presents other research, and then it leads up to the experience I had as an expert witness for one of the guards who did terrible things at the prison of Abu Ghraib in Iraq. And I'm going to show you some of the terrible things they did. And we'll also be signing some books if you're interested. So although the book is really focused on the negatives, the last chapter is a celebration of heroism, but you have to go through 50 chapters of grim stuff. The book is really a celebration of the human mind's infinite capacity to make any of us kind or cruel, caring or indifferent. Some of us, it makes us creative, and others lead a life of destructiveness. And it pushes some of us to be villains, to do really bad things, to be predators. But it pushes some of us to be heroes. So that's the incredible thing that we carry around, this mind with infinite capacity to be anything. So evil, the psychological definition that I use, is evil is the exercise of power, and that's the key. It's the exercise of power and the abuse of power to intentionally harm other people psychologically, through prejudice, through discrimination, to hurt physically through torture. And we're going to hear about a young man who was brutalized by American guards, to destroy mortally. And when crime is committed by nations, that's the worst evil, because that's crimes against humanity, that's genocide. So if you Google the word evil, in 130, you get 130 million hits in a third of a second. Our former President George Bush would be lost without the word. If you Google his name and evil, you get 2 million hits. Remember when he came into power, everybody, this was evil empire, this evil person, this was the Sunday Times. So here he is. Anybody seen Osama bin Laden lately? He says, them evildoers everywhere, but they can't hide under my bush. So now, my talk today is really going to focus on the power of the situation to make good people do bad things. But of course, there are people whose lives have been orchestrated around harm, killing. And Hitler and Stalin qualify as evildoers. And this is what we call dispositional evil, that the evil can be seen to reside inside of the person's response style, personality style. For young people, it's Darth Vader is the modern symbol of evil. But to bring it down to earth, I want to use as a case study what American soldiers did to Iraqi prisoners in Abu Ghraib prison, 2003, and I call this digitally documented depravity. These are pictures from the cameras of United States military policemen, Army reservists, not real police, not real soldiers. They have no training in combat. And it happened only in one place, only on the night shift in Tier 1A. So we want to say, why only the night shift, not in the day shift? Why only in Tier 1A? Some of these images are violent, and some of them include nakedness, because nakedness was used as a dehumanization tactic. It was actually promoted by Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld as a tactic for dehumanization in Guantanamo Bay, and then brought over to Abu Ghraib. If you care to look away at some point, I can tell you when to look back, when it starts without the nudity, then there's a section with nudity. What I've done is, as an expert witness, I had access to the 1,000 images, and what I've done is put them in a short segment with some sound and some movement to emphasize the emotional impact. And again, throughout this, imagine being a prisoner subjected to this abuse. And then the question we want to ask is why? Why did they do this? How do we understand how soldiers who might have started out as good apples became bad apples? So let's go down to that dungeon. Is it possible to dim these lights? You can see better. This is the famous iconic image of torture. So this is the nudity part. If you could look down, just take a minute. Oh, sorry. This is a guard on duty on the night shift. And imagine you're a prisoner and the guard is walking around with that face paint on. It's the face paint of a rock group in New York, in America, called Insane Clown Posse, ICP. And this is a prisoner who was mentally ill, who covered himself with his own feces, and the guards would roll him in dirt so he wouldn't smell bad. And I set the ironic contrast with that and Leonardo da Vinci's humanity. And so here's Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld and Brigadier General Janis Karpinski, who was supposed to be in charge of the prison, but clearly was not. He wants to know who are the bad apples. The problem with asking that question, it focuses on the person, when he should have said, what were the conditions that produced this? Because in my investigation of the person I defended, Chip Frederick, he was the sergeant in charge. He was a good apple, as good a soldier, as good a father, as good a husband, as good a citizen as I could imagine, until he went down to that dungeon. And in a very short time, the situation corrupted him. Everybody on the night shift, there were 9 soldiers, 3 women and 6 men, did some of those bad things. Some did more, some did less. And not a single soldier on the day shift did. How come? On the day shift, there were always senior officers present with surveillance, with oversight. On the night shift, there was not a single officer ever went down to the dungeon for 3 months. Well, before that, I have to tell you, Tier 1A was the interrogation center. This was the place where, after Bush said, mission accomplished, we've won the war in Iraq, the insurgency broke out. And they were clueless. So they started arresting all the men and boys around any explosion, bringing them down there to interrogate them, and they had no information to give. So there were 3 interrogation units. One was military intelligence, a second one was the CIA, and a third one was a civilian contractor, Titan Corporation. And they were competing who would get the information, who would break the information about the insurgency. And they're getting nothing. So military intelligence goes to military police and says, we need your guys to break the prisons, take the gloves off, do whatever you have to do so that when we interrogate them, we're going to get results. And then they give them no limits. They say, do what you have to do, meaning, but they never thought they would take pictures. That was the difference. They didn't care what they did. In fact, they didn't want to see it, and of course they would say, we never knew what they were doing. All the soldiers on the night shift were dishonorably discharged. Some got 10 years in prison. The person I defended got 8 years. The woman, Linda England, got 3 years. Others got 1 year. Not a single officer went to trial. Not a single officer got a letter of reprimand. So this is how the system always covers itself. And when I saw the picture of the man with his face paint, I knew as soon as I saw that he knew that no officer would ever come down, because being out of uniform, he would be censured. So how do psychologists understand the transformation of human nature like that? Assuming these were good apples at one point, and now they did these horrific things. The typical way we approach it, and not only psychologists, all of us, we look for the person. We say, what is it about the individual? Because individuals are the actors on the stage. What is it about the person? What is the personality traits, genes? But that doesn't get us very far until we say, people are always in a social context, in a situation. And this is where social psychologists like me come in and say, we really have to understand, and this is what Penny just said, the circumstances. Not until I got involved in Abu Ghraib in a very intense personal way that I said, that's not enough. We have to understand the system, because that's the power. That's the legal, cultural, political, economic base. So when looking at the person, those are the bad apples. When looking at the situation, that's the bad barrel that we put people into. But the question is, who makes the bad barrel? And that's where the power is. So when you want to change human behavior, typically we always begin and end here, with education, with therapy. And if you don't change the situation, nothing changes in the long run. But before we can begin to change situations, we have to know, who is behind it. We have to know if there is the mafia behind it, is the Catholic Church behind it, is the media behind it, because we need to have this 3-level analysis. So the Lucifer Effect says, to understand human character transformation, it's always the dynamic interplay between what do people bring into any situation, what does the situation bring out of us, and what is the system that creates, maintains, and justifies, typically legally, those situations. So I want to very quickly mention two studies, some of which you know about. One was done by my high school classmate, Stanley Milgram, a little Jewish kid. He was obsessed when we were in high school. Could the Holocaust happen in America? Could he be put in a concentration camp? And he asked the question, suppose Hitler asked you to electrocute a stranger, would you do it? People say, no, don't be silly. He said, how do you know unless you were put in that situation? So his experiment actually put 1,000 ordinary Americans in a situation where they were encouraged to shock another person, literally until almost the point at which it was lethal. It was considered the most unethical study ever done until I did my study. But I just take a moment to say, in his own words, why did he do this research? We can have the sound up.
When I learn of incidents such as the massacre of millions of men, women, and children perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II, how is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, who are courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? Now, there are some studies in my discipline, social psychology, that seem to provide a clue to this question. The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience?
So he did the study at first at Yale University with 500 men, and then he repeated it with 500 other people, including women, in a small town in Connecticut, because he didn't want the study to be limited to the power of Yale. And the study, very simply, is he recruits people through newspaper ads saying, we want to help people improve their memory, and we think by punishing errors that will help improve their memory. So your job as the teacher is to give your pupil information to learn. When he gets it right, you reward him. When he gets it wrong, you punish him with electric shock. And so there's a shock generated in front of you. You begin by pressing the first button, which is 15 volts. There's no response. And then each increment is by 15 volts, 15, 30, 45. And that's the brilliance. All evil begins with 15 volts. All evil begins with pressing that first small button, signing a little thing, making a little donation, cheating just a little bit, lying just a little bit. And at any point, you're only slightly different than where you were. So even when you're up to 100 volts, it's only slightly different than 85 volts. When it gets up to in the hundreds, the guy in the other room starts to scream and yell, I quit. And of course, these are decent people like all of us, and they turn to the experiment and say, sir, I don't think I want to go on. He seems to be in pain. The experiment says, I'm sorry, you have a contract. You must go on. And then he starts screaming louder and louder, and everybody says, sir, who's going to be responsible? He said, I will, of course. I'm the experimenter. You must go on. So now it's a diffusion of responsibility. And it goes on and on. When it gets to 370 volts, the guy screams, there's a thud and silence. You say, sir, something is wrong with him. He's unconscious. And the experiment says, I'm sorry, you don't understand. A failure to respond is an error of omission, the same as an error of commission. You must continue. At that point, who would go on? It doesn't make sense. How could you be helping him improve his memory if he's dead? Not much. Or if he's unconscious. The sad thing is, so the question is, would anybody go all the way up to 450 volts? And it says triple X, pornography of power. Well, the data is dramatic. Here's the number of people who drop out at different shock levels. And nobody drops out to 285 volts. He's been yelling and screaming. When it gets to 375, when the guy yells and screams, there's a thud, only one person drops out. 2/3 go all the way. 2 out of every 3 people go to the very end, despite the guy yelling and screaming. In fact, before Milgram did the study, he asked 40 psychiatrists to judge what percent of American citizens would go all the way, given the description that he gave, like mine. They said 1%. They said it's sadistic behavior, and only 1% of Americans, 1% of people in any country are sadists. How could they be so wrong? They are trained in the dispositional focus. They ignore all of the situational things, the white lab coat, playing the roles, the shock box, all of these situational factors they ignored, and therefore they could not be more wrong. This study has been replicated many times in many countries with a similar effect. So his study is about the power of an authority to get a person to do a bad thing. My sense is that rarely happens in life. What happens is we are in families, we're in schools, we're in churches, we're in synagogues, we're in mosques, we're in the army, we're in corporations. We are embedded in institutions. So I created the Stanford Prison Study to say, what happens when we embed good people in a bad setting? What happens when we put really good people in a bad prison-like setting, a setting mirrored after American prisons? So we put an ad in the paper. We wanted college students. In the Milgram study, the important thing was there were no students. These are all adults. I wanted to say, let's get the best and brightest. So we got 75 people to answer our ad. We gave them personality tests, interviews. We wanted to pick 24. Half are going to be guards randomly, half will be prisoners, who were at the beginning as good apples as we could find, and then we're going to randomly assign them. You be a guard, you be a prisoner, and we're going to put them into a bad place, a situation, a very realistic mock situation.
Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing.
This is Stanford University. The psych department is right here. So it made it very realistic. We had the city police arrest the boys who were going to be prisoners in their homes or dormitories.
A police car pulls up in front, and a cop comes to the front door and knocks and says he's looking for me. So they took me out the door. They put my hands against the car. It was a real cop car. It was a real policeman, and there were real neighbors in the street who didn't know that this was a experiment. And there was cameras all around and neighbors all around. They put me in the car, then they drove me around Palo Alto. They took me to the police station, the basement of the police station. Then they put me in a cell. I was the first one to be picked up, so they put me in a cell, which is just like a room with a door with bars on it. You could tell it wasn't a real jail. They locked me in there in this degrading little outfit. They were taking this experiment too seriously.
Sure we were. So again, the prisoners, we took away their names. They became numbers. We put them in these smocks. They had to wear chains on their feet at all times, so even when they're sleeping, would remind them they've lost their freedom. The guards, on the other hand, had symbols of power, billy clubs, handcuffs, whistles, and silver-reflecting sunglasses that helped dehumanize them. The prisoners began just as you saw in Abu Ghraib. Simple things, push-ups, jumping jacks, but it always escalates toward more and more abuse and degradation. Because prisons are all about one thing, power. Guards have to demonstrate that they have power and prisoners have none. And so that's the constant battle. Prisoners trying to have some power, some freedom, and guards trying to suppress it.
In 1971, Phil Zimbardo conducted a revolutionary experiment here in the bowels of Stanford University in the United States. It rocked the world of psychology. A group of students were divided randomly into prisoners and guards and lived in a makeshift jail. The prisoners immediately became submissive, and the guards became cruel.
Not only not getting a cigarette, but for as long as the cell's blockaded, you're...
Within a week, Phil Zimbardo's prison was inhumane, and the experiment had to be cut short.
But before that, the guards each day escalated the level of humiliation, degradation, having cleaning toilet bowls out with their bare hands, stripping prisoners naked. At the end of 5 days, the guards were having the prisoners simulate sodomy. You saw in Abu Ghraib, they simulated a fellatio, and also in Basra, the British had Iraqi prisoners also simulate sodomy. These are students, knowing they're in an experiment, knowing that the boys who were playing the role of prisoners had done nothing, except for a flip of the coin, they would be in a reverse position. But it didn't matter. It became a psychological prison in their mind, run by psychologists, not by the state. And the boy you saw, the first one to be arrested, he had an emotional breakdown in 36 hours in an experiment, and he became a model of how you get out. All anybody had to say is, I quit the experiment, and I would have to release them. Because the experiment actually was supervised by Stanford's Human Subject Committee. But nobody said that. They said, I want to be released. I want to go to the parole board, which they did, and the parole board always turns them down. They mimicked, they followed the model of the young boy who had a breakdown. And so each day for 5 days, a prison had a breakdown. And so we ended the study after 6 days. It was supposed to go for 2 weeks, but it had actually spun out of control. We have a wonderful website I'd love you to visit. It's called prisonexp.org, and we have it in 6 different languages: German, Spanish, Polish, Italian, and Farsi, in fact. You might be interested. So again, all experiments are artificial. So you want to say, what is the real-world parallel? Well, here's the guards bringing the prisoners to the parole board with bags over their heads, chains on their feet. And now we go to Iraq. Bigger bags, but with big guns. And here's Guantanamo, Cuba prison, bags over their heads. There are many reports about what happened at Abu Ghraib. There's actually a dozen. One of them, for me, which is really important for us, was by James Schlesinger, former Secretary of Defense. And he says very quickly, I'll go through quickly, the potential of abusive treatment of detainees during a global war on terrorism was entirely predictable based on a fundamental understanding of the principles of social psychology, coupled with an awareness of numerous known environmental risk factors. That's Penny's circumstances. Findings from the field of social psychology suggest that the conditions of war, the dynamics of detainee operations, carry inherent risk for human mistreatment and therefore must be approached with great caution, careful planning and training, and they knew it and there was none. And he goes on to say, psychologists have attempted to understand how and why individuals and groups who usually act humanely, we're usually good people, can sometimes act otherwise in certain circumstances. That's the Lucifer Effect. And then he says, the landmark Stanford study provides a cautionary tale for all military detention operations. It should have been so. Power without oversight is a recipe for abuse everywhere and anywhere. The government knew this, although they blamed the grunts, the soldiers at the end, dishonorably discharged them. General Miller at Guantanamo sent a friend of mine, Larry James, the colonel, to Abu Ghraib, and he wrote a book called Fixing Hell. Essentially, it meant we have to change the system, not put better guards in or get worse guards out. So very quickly, I want to switch from evil to good. What makes us good and what makes us evil? The interesting thing is that there's a lot of research on all the conditions that lead ordinary people to do evil. There is almost no research on heroism. Any question you ask me about about is compassion necessary to be a hero? No answer. What's the difference between a reactive hero, somebody who jumps on the railroad tracks to save somebody, and somebody who is a whistleblower, who collects data about fraud or corruption? We don't know. So I've developed a group called the Heroic Imagination Project to stimulate research and do research and encourage graduate students everywhere to do research, as well as other things. So it's time to promote social goodness, moral courage, and heroism. Ending on a positive note, heroism is the antidote to evil. By promoting the heroic imagination, we want to create a new educational system online and in classrooms that instills in every child a self-belief. I am a hero in training. I am learning skills, so I will act. That's the key to being a hero. You have to act. I will act heroically when opportunity calls for moral courage and compassion. And the idea that any one of us can be a hero. I want to get away from the notion that heroes are special people. Say, most heroic deeds are done by ordinary people. In fact, we typically don't know about it unless the media identifies them. So just very quickly, here's a famous picture. Here's a media picture of this young Chinese student in Tiananmen Square stopping a row of tanks about to come in and crush the student dissenters. And so he's heroic, but also the captain of the tank who turned around and went the other way is heroic. He's a little Chinese boy, 9-year-old Lin Hao. I call him a dutiful hero. Just before the Olympics, there was an earthquake in Sichuan province. His schools collapsed. He was one of the few that escaped, and as he's running away, he turns and sees two little kids, classmates, struggling to get out. He runs back and helps them out. People say, "Why did you do that? Why did you threaten your life?" He said, I was the hall monitor. It was my job to look after my classmates. So he's put in a position that this is his duty, and that's the heroic imagination put into action because he had unique opportunity. Here's the guy who stopped Abu Ghraib. Lowest level private in the Army Reserve. He sees the pictures that you saw, and he goes to a senior investigating officer. He said, "Sir, this is a disgrace. We're here to bring dignity and freedom to these people, and we're humiliating them." He knew what? He knew his buddies were going to get in trouble, and he would get in trouble. They had to put him in hiding, and then his mother and his wife for 3 years, because not only did the other soldiers want to kill him, but people in his conservative hometown as well. He was recently released and was given an honor ceremony at the Kennedy Center by Miss Kennedy. Here's a woman in Warsaw, realized that the Nazis had put all the Jews in a ghetto, preparing them to send them to concentration camps. But while they were there was not enough food, there was disease, and she organized 20 other women and one man to form a network to get the kids out of the ghetto and send them all around, hide them. They caught her, they tortured her, she never said where the kids were, and she wasn't a hero because when the Nazis left, the communists came in and they were also anti-Semitic. And it was only a few years ago that she was identified in Israel as one of the righteous among the Gentiles and became a hero in Poland. And she just died 2 years ago. Here's a Polish-American hero who stopped the Stanford Prison Study. She was a student of mine who came down to the experiment on the fifth night, and what she saw was at 10 o'clock the guards lined up the prisoners to go to the toilet. Bags over their heads, chains on their feet, cursing and yelling. I look up, and for me it's nothing more than a check mark. It's the 10 o'clock toilet run. I say, "Hey, Chris, look at this." And she begins to tear up. I said, "What's wrong with you?" And she says, "It's terrible what you're doing to those boys. They're not guards, they're boys, and you're responsible." And then runs out, and we start arguing outside, and we had just started dating. Because she was obviously a beautiful woman. And she says to me, "You've changed. I don't know who you are." She said, "If this is the real you, I don't want to have anything to do with you." And what she was saying is, I had become the Stanford Prison administrator. I had lost my compassion for people because administrators care about guards, not prisoners, care about the institution. And at that point, I said, "Oh my God, you're right." And so she was the one who forced me to end the study. At least 50 other people, including parents, girlfriends, boyfriends, psychologists, had come down during that week, and everybody said it's an interesting simulation, it's an interesting demonstration. She was the one who said the emperor has no clothes and forced me to end the study. So what did I do with her? I married her the next year, and we've lived happily ever after. So I'm going to end this by saying the Heroic Imagination Project is a new project, a nonprofit we've just started in San Francisco, to encourage children, families, everyone to develop the heroic imagination, to think of yourself as a hero in training, for some situation to provide a catalyst for action on behalf of others in need or in defense of a moral cause. So that's what heroes are. They act on behalf of others in need or in defense of a moral cause, aware that there's a cost. Altruism is heroism light. And you do it without expectation of reward. So heroes are ordinary people who put their best self forward in service to humanity. Heroes give up egocentrism for sociocentrism. So I want to end with this incredible story of a young man, African-American man, who's standing on a subway track. A white guy falls across the track. He sees the subway coming in, and the guy's going to be cut in half. He's got a reason not to be involved. He's got two little girls, and there are 75 people on the platform, all of whom freeze. In those situations, there's evil of inaction. Most people do nothing. Instead, he turns to somebody and says, take care of my kids. He jumps down on the track to try to save him. And as you'll see in a moment, he almost had his head cut off except for a half an inch between the top of his head and the bottom of the train. When they asked him, why'd you do that? He said, I did what anyone could do, but I did what everyone ought to do. So that's the moral imperative. So we'll just look at this, and then we'll bring up our next speakers.
On the New York City subway, it's hard enough finding someone who will give up his seat to a stranger, let alone be willing to give up his life for one.
The train was coming in like that.
It happened just 50-year-old Wesley Autry, a construction worker and Navy veteran, was standing on a subway platform with his two little girls when right in front of them, a man started having a seizure.
He kind of stumbled and over his own feet and fall backwards. I feel a train coming, but the train is so close, I'm like, what do I do?
Wesley jumped onto the tracks and thought if he could just lie on top of the man, keep him from flailing, maybe the train would roll right over both of them. The clearance was exactly 21 inches. Wesley and the man, 20 and a half.
No way the train can stop before this gentleman could get him up off the tracks. So he covered him with his body and pushed him down to a point where the train wouldn't hit his head and held him down under the tracks while the train came and rolled right over to the top.
It gave Wesley's children the scare of their young lives.
I thought he was going to get killed.
And Wesley, the scare of his, too.
I'm like talking to him, sir, you can't move. I got two kids up here looking for the father to come back. I don't know you, you don't know me, but don't panic. I'm here to save you.
As for the guy Wesley saved, he's 20-year-old Cameron Hollander. And other than a few scrapes and bruises, his father says he's doing fine.
Mr. Autry's instinctive and unselfish act saved our son's life.
The word hero gets thrown around a lot nowadays.
What a better way to start off the new year than to save a life.
Nice to be reminded of what one really looks like.
So, around the world send in their ordinary heroes that we would vet and then put on a mega website so that you could search it. So if you were a 10-year-old girl in Dubai, you could look up, girls, heroes, and be inspired. And so heroism is something you could aspire to. Thank you very much.